Hello, welcome to today's tutorial. Today we're going to cover a complete DevOps pipeline. This is a full hands-on tutorial. Everything will be live. It's designed for beginners, so we'll walk through all the stages that are required to build a complete DevOps pipeline. This includes building the artifacts, creating a container, pushing the container, doing some security checks. And with that said, let's actually walk through what it is we'll be doing. So the pipeline that we're building today is once a developer pushes their code into an SCM, in our case, we're going to be using GitHub, we'll push the code into an application repository. Jenkins will then be notified that there's been a new application update. Jenkins will then build and test the application. In our case, we're using a Java application, so we'll use Maven to build the application to perform some tests. Once the application has completed building, we'll analyze that application using a static code analysis tool called Sonarqube. This will help us identify any potential code smells, security issues, and help the developers remediate any potential problems before code is pushed into production. If everything is successful, we'll build and push a Docker image into our Docker Hub registry. At the same time, we'll also scan the Docker image with Trivy using a SCA or a static analysis. This will identify any additional vulnerabilities that may reside within the container. So this is another security check before the image gets pushed into our production Kubernetes cluster. We'll then update a set of manifest files. These manifest files will reside in a separate repository. In our case, it's going to be a DevOps repository. It'll contain a deployment manifest as well as a service manifest. And we'll update these with each successful pipeline build to have the latest version of the tag. Once the tag has been updated, Argo CD, which is a continuous delivery or continuous deployment application, will be monitoring that repository for any changes. As soon as a new tag is detected, it'll deploy the latest version of the tag into our Kubernetes cluster. We'll then send a Slack notification if the deployment and build is successful. We'll also send a notification if there are any problems during the build steps along the way. We'll do this using a declarative pipeline in Jenkins. So we'll walk through each of the stages and I'll explain in as much detail as possible to keep you informed. So please fuel up. This is a live real-time tutorial, which means that it is going to take some time. I do encourage you to watch the entire video because we'll get into some of the specifics. We'll address some questions that may potentially come up on interviews for folks that are potentially looking to get into a DevOps role. So with that said, let's jump right into the hands-on portion of this. Okay, so the first thing that we need to do is we need to set up Jenkins. In my case, I'm using individual virtual machines, but you can install this all on a single node or a single virtual machine. But to simulate as close to production as possible, I'm going to go ahead and use individual virtual machines. I've also gone ahead and created DNS entries for each one of the IP addresses so that we can use reverse proxies as well as TLS certificates, again, to simulate as close to production as possible. So the first thing that we need to do is we need to sign into our first virtual machine where the Jenkins UI will reside and then become root. So in my case, that is running on this particular IP address, and then we're going to become root. The next thing that we need to do is we need to make sure that we have updated our packages and then install Java. And we can just copy and paste these commands directly from the documentation. And I'll leave the documentation link in the video description below. So let's update our packages. Let's go ahead and install Java. Again, here you can use OpenJDK. I've chosen to use Adoption's Tamarin version 17. And you can copy and paste these commands, or please feel free to use OpenJDK if that's something that you prefer. So let's copy that command, paste that here, and then we'll go ahead and update and install Java. So as you can see, I've already installed this in the past, so it doesn't need to upgrade since it's already running the latest version. Next, what we need to do is we need to install Jenkins. So to do this, we're going to use the official repository from Jenkins directly, and we'll install the latest LTS of the long-term support version of Jenkins. So to do that, let's go ahead and configure our repository. So we can copy these commands here. And then we'll want to add our actual packages here. So let's go ahead and copy this. Okay, once we've done that, we'll want to update just to make sure that we can fetch the latest versions. And then we can go ahead and install Jenkins. Now this may take a moment or two, but I'm going to leave this recording going because, as I promised, it's going to be a live, unedited version of a tutorial just to give you a real-world sense of how the installation goes, as well as a complete DevOps pipeline. If you're enjoying this video, I'll take this opportunity to ask if you could please give it a thumbs up. A subscription is greatly appreciated. It also helps the YouTube algorithm. So it looks like Jenkins is almost completed here. And if we go back to the documentation and we look at the next steps, we'll need to start Jenkins, and then we'll need to go ahead and do some configuration. So let's see if Jenkins has now finished installing, which it has. So let's start it. And we can take a look at the startup to see if it's finished starting up by looking at the status. So let's look at the status of Jenkins, and we can indeed see here that it is active and running. So now that's completed, we can access our Jenkins user interface using the IP address. By default, Jenkins runs on port 8080. Now keep in mind, we haven't done any reverse proxy configuration yet, so we do need to access this via our IP address. So if we were to go to HTTP 192.168, and it's running on 10, port 8080, we'll see that we can now see Jenkins. Now the initial password is stored on the file system, and we can retrieve it by taking a look at this file here. So let's copy this and cat that file. So this will be our initial password. So let's add our initial password. And then we're just going to go ahead and install the suggested plugins. This may take a few moments to get installed. So what we can do in the meantime is we can proceed with the documentation to start installing Nginx and setting up our reverse proxy so we can access Jenkins through a domain name. So if we go back over to our documentation, we can see here that we have a guide that's specifically designed to help install the reverse proxy. So here what we need to do is we need to install Nginx. So let's go back to our terminal window and install Nginx. Once Nginx is installed, we'll be able to access our server on the IP address, and we can see that it is running. So here we actually accessed our Jenkins application directly on port 8080, but now what we can do is we can actually just hit the IP address and we'll see that we get the welcome to Nginx. So next we need to go ahead and configure our Nginx to point to Jenkins through a reverse proxy. So to do that, we need to create a configuration file. So let's copy this. Let's create the configuration file. And I've already gone ahead and created a sample config file. Just remember to change your domain name. In my case, I'm using my domain name that I've already created a DNS record for. So let's copy that and paste that in here. We'll then want to test to make sure that the configuration is correct. But before we do that, we need to enable it. And we can do that by creating a symbolic link for the configuration file into our sites enabled. So let's first do that. And then let's test to make sure that there's no typos in the configuration. And everything looks good. So the next thing we need to do is we need to restart Jenkins. Perfect. So what this now means is if we go back into our browser window, we should be able to access the server using the domain name. So if we go to jenkins.dev.dman.cloud, and by default, it does try to redirect it to HTTPS. So let's make sure that we change that to HTTP. And we can see that it is indeed bringing us to our Jenkins installation as expected. So we're going to ignore this just for a second because we want to complete our setup. So if we head back over to the window where we had originally kicked off our plugin installation, we can see the plugins have finished installing and it's now asking us to create our first admin user. So let's go ahead and create an admin user. And be sure to set a secure password because we are going to be exposing this to the internet. So we want to make sure that the password is not easy to guess. And then we'll give it a email address. And then we can save and continue. So since we have already created a domain name that's mapped to our Jenkins, we can change this. By default, it's going to use what we had accessed this with originally. But in our case, we know that we're going to be using a domain name and we're also going to be using a certificate. So let's just get a head start on that and we can configure this to use HTTPS. And we know that it's going to be using the domain name of Jenkins, in our case, jenkins.dev.dman.cloud. Remember to include the trailing slash. So let's save and finish. So we can now hit start using Jenkins. But before we move any further, let's go ahead and add a certificate to secure our installation. So what I'll do is I'll close out these two windows and then we'll head back into the documentation. And there's a tutorial here which shows you how to configure Jenkins with TLS. Now, a lot of this work we've done by installing Nginx previously, so we can skip down to the section here where we need to install certbot. So let's copy that. Let's install certbot. And then we can skip the rest of this section because we've just confirmed that Nginx has been set up since we just did it a moment ago. And then we just need to go ahead and create a certificate. So you can use this command. Again, just make sure you use the domain name that you're using in your setup. So let's copy that. And then we will need to provide our email address and then accept the terms of services. We can say no to sharing our information. And then this will now go ahead and request and install our certificate into Nginx. This usually only takes about 10 to 15 seconds, depends on how busy the servers are. So we can see that it's already fetched the certificate, it's deployed it, and everything is now running. So if we go back to our browser, we can now, or we should be able to hit our Jenkins installation on our secure URL. And we can indeed. So you can see that we've now got the security lock or the padlock here, and we have a valid certificate. So let's sign in. And the next thing that we need to do is we need to configure an agent for us to execute our jobs on. It's best practice to not run any jobs on the machine that's running the user interface. Now, there's lots of different ways that you can do this. You can have a dedicated virtual machine that runs jobs. You can use Docker. This can also be installed inside of Kubernetes. For the sake of this tutorial, we're going to actually use a separate virtual machine that'll act as the agent node, and we'll configure that using SSH. So if we head back into our documentation, we have a tutorial here that shows us how to add an SSH-based agent into Jenkins. So what we need to do is we need to sign into our agent machine and run these steps. So let's go back to our terminal. We will exit out of the Jenkins UI, and then we will now sign into another virtual machine that I've created that's going to act as our agent. So we can see that we are now signed into this second machine. So let's go ahead and become root. And just like before, we want to make sure that we've got the latest versions of the packages that are installed so we can run a quick update followed by an upgrade. And then we want to run our agent as a specific user. We don't want to run it as root. So let's create a user. In our case, we'll use the user Jenkins. So let's add a user Jenkins, set a secure password. Now remember this password because you will need to use this in the future. And we'll call this the Jenkins agent. And then we'll want to make sure that we grant sudo privileges to the user that we've just created. And we can do that by copying this command. The next thing that we need to do is we need to install Java on this machine as well. So just like before, I've got the installation instructions here. This tutorial talks about Java 11, but we'll change that to use Java 17. But the steps are the same. So let's just copy the Adoptium repository and add that. And again, we are missing wget here. So let's install wget on this machine. And then now we can add the repository. And in this case, what we're going to do is we'll update, but we will install version 17. And once that's installed, since we're going to be building and pushing Docker containers, we'll want to make sure that we have Docker installed on this machine as well. So I do have instructions here. These instructions are actually for Ubuntu Linux. So what we'll do is let's just head over to Docker's official webpage and copy the commands to install Docker on Debian 11. So let's just search for this, and we get presented with the steps that we need to run here. So let's go through and copy these blocks of code. Again, I'm not getting into the specifics of the installation of the tools here because we want to focus on building that pipeline. And then let's update. And then finally, we can install Docker. Now, once this is installed, we do want to make sure that we give privileges to the Jenkins user. And the way to do that is to make sure that we add the Jenkins user to the Docker group. If we scroll down to the bottom of this page, there's some post-installation steps. So here, what we can do is create a group called Docker. And in our case, this has already been created. So if I run this, it'll say already exists. And then we want to add the Jenkins user here into the Docker group. And then we can run new group Docker as the user Jenkins. So right now we're signed in as root. So let's go ahead and become Jenkins. And then we can run Docker run hello world just to make sure that we're able to successfully run Docker, and we can. Perfect. So now that we have Docker installed, let's head back to our documentation. We've already added the non-root user here. So the next thing to do is we need to connect our two virtual machines to communicate via a remote SSH agent. So here what we need to do is from the Jenkins UI, we need to sign in to our Jenkins agent. So again, the UI is the first virtual machine that we set up. That's the one that has the user interface, and the agent is where we'll be executing our jobs. So let's clean up our screens here a little bit just to make it easier. And I'm going to open up two terminals. So on the left-hand side, I am going to sign into our Jenkins UI. And then from here, we want to connect as the user Jenkins to our agent host. And this is also that we can get the SSH keys set up correctly. There's lots of different ways that this can be accomplished. This is just the easiest way that I found that works. So let's sign into our machine here. And we've signed in as Jenkins. So the next thing we need to do is we need to create some SSH key pairs. So let's copy this command And let's get those key pairs set up. We're not going to use a passphrase. And we're going to change the permissions just to make them a little bit more secure. Okay, and it looks like that we may have a typo here, but that is okay. That's not a big deal. We just missed the .pub here, so we can let's see why that is happening here. Oh, it did actually change permissions. Okay, not quite sure what happened there. Anyway, so the next thing that we need to do is we need to take a copy of our private key. So let's cat the private key, and we'll need to keep note of this. Now, the other thing that I want to do is just to make sure that the SSH doesn't keep prompting us for the sign in on the first time. Let's go into our Jenkins agent, which is the one that will be connecting to the UI for it to run its jobs. So I know we're already signed in here. So what we can do is from this machine, let's SSH as the user Jenkins, but this time we're going to go back into the user interface virtual machine. So let's go ahead and sign in here. So this just ensures that we've gone ahead and created the node host, and I didn't set the password yet. So we can go ahead and sign into this machine, and let's create a password for Jenkins. And we need to do that as root. So now that we've done that, we can log into that machine. Okay, perfect. Okay, so the next thing that we need to do is let's head back over into our Jenkins UI. And we're going to manage Jenkins. And we're going to manage nodes and clouds. And the first thing that we'll do is we'll disable any executors from running on our user interface. So let's click on configure under this guy and make it 0. And then if we head back up to nodes, add a new node, and then let's give it a name. So let's call this Jenkins agent. We'll make this a permanent agent. And then the description is optional. We'll allow 2 concurrent executors to run at the same time. And here we need to specify the remote root directory. So we want this to be home Jenkins. We'll assign this a label of Jenkins agent. And again, keep in mind what you use here, because we'll use this in our pipeline upcoming here in just a little bit. We're going to use this node as much as possible. And we're going to actually connect via SSH. So here we need to specify the agent's IP address. So again, pick the IP address that matches what you have set up. In our case, it is running on .11. And we don't have any credentials. So here's where we need to add that private key. So let's click on Add Jenkins. And then we're going to choose SSH username with private key. And then we're going to call this our Jenkins agent key. We'll give it the same description. The username is Jenkins. And then we're going to enter that private key directly. So what we need to do is go back over and we need to copy this entire block that we had catted earlier. So let's copy this. And then let's paste that in here. There's no passphrase, so we can add. Now it's important to make sure you go back and actually select the key here. And everything else we can leave as default. So let's go ahead and hit save. And now this agent should be connected. So let's go into the agent and look at the log. And it looks like no known host was found. Okay, so this is what we were describing earlier. So we can see here that on our Jenkins UI, there's no known host file. So if we copy this, and this is good. This is why I wanted to do it live so we can troubleshoot some of these issues. So let's copy that. Let's go into our Jenkins UI and change into that directory. So we can see here, if we look at the logs, it's looking for a .ssh known hosts, and it doesn't exist. And the easiest way to create this is just to simply SSH from here as the user Jenkins into our agent node. So let's do that. And this will create the known host file for us. So now we can exit back out to our UI. And if we take a look at the listings, we now see a .ssh, and we can see this known hosts has been created. So if we go back into our UI, what we can do is we can just hit configure and then hit save and relaunch agent. So this should now allow us to connect. Okay, let's see. It looks like there's another failure. So the SSH key does not match the known host. The SSH key exchange was not finished. Now let's troubleshoot why this might be happening. So just give me a moment here while I think why this might be happening. So let's go back over here again. Let's make sure that that known host is in here. Let's go into our agent machine. And actually, before we do that, let's just make sure we didn't miss a step in our documentation. So what we did, we forgot this step. This is a very important step. So we need to make sure that we add the public SSH key to the list of authorized hosts on that agent machine. So what we need to do is we need to cat the public key and add it to our authorized hosts. So let's copy this and let's go back into our agent host, which is here on the right-hand side. And then we can head into our SSH directory. And then here, we need to run this command. So now we can go back, take a look at our nodes. Let's go into our agent and launch that agent again. Okay, so now we can see that we've successfully connected and come online. Again, these are the types of things that will come up. Nothing will be perfect as you go through your DevOps journey. So it's good to be able to do some troubleshooting. So we've already identified one area where you could potentially run into issues, which is making sure that the agent and the user interface for Jenkins can communicate. Okay, so now that we've got that out of the way and we know that we can connect our agent, let's do a very quick test. Let's just make sure that we can execute a job. So let's just call this test. We'll create a pipeline job. And what we'll do here is we'll just use a hello world that's built into Jenkins here. And since we've disabled any executors on the UI and we've got this set to agent any, this should now run on our agent node. So let's just go ahead and save, build now. And we can see that it has successfully built. Perfect. So we now know that we can run our jobs on our agent node. So we can go ahead and clean this now up. So let's delete this. Okay, so the next thing that we need to do is we need to make sure that we configure our pipeline with a complete DevOps pipeline. So Let's go ahead and do that. So what I've done is I've created an application that you can use. I'll make the repos public after this demonstration, but just to show you how to use the credentials against private repos, it's private for right now. And the application is just a simple Java application that launches a very basic web page. So if we go back into our terminal, we can clean up these windows here. And then let's just go back to our local machine. And I've got a project created here. And you can clone this. So it's called Complete End-to-End Pipeline Production. This is on my Git repo here. And I'll make these links all available. So I've already gone ahead and cloned this. There's no Jenkins or pipelines that have been configured. But just to show you what this does, let's very quickly just run a build of this job. So if we do a clean install, and then we'll run the application from our local machine, which of course is not our ultimate goal. Our ultimate goal is to create this into a Docker container and publish it into Kubernetes. But let's take a look at what it is we're doing here. So we've built it, and then by default, Spring Boot will launch its application on localhost port 8080. So let's go back and take a look at what the application is. So here we can see this is just an HTML page that talks about the end-to-end DevOps pipeline. Perfect. So we know the application itself works. So now let's head back into our local machine. And here, what we can do is we can start building out that Jenkins file. So let's go ahead and create a Jenkins file. I'm going to be using Visual Studio Code. It's my editor of choice. Again, you can use anything that you're comfortable with. That could be Sublime. Maybe you're used to just using VI. In my case, I'm used to using Visual Studio. So let's open up this project from its current working directory. And then what we'll do is we'll create a new file at the root, and we'll call it Jenkins file. So let's create a new file. We'll call it Jenkins file. And then here what we need to do is we need to first set up our initial pipeline. So if we start with typing pipeline, I have a plugin installed that goes ahead and just creates a skeleton, but we'll walk through each one of these. So we'll remove some of these sections because we'll build them out as we go through the project. So we're going to eliminate this post section to start with. And then we'll remove some of the post sections that exist in the first stage here. So let's go ahead and remove that. And then what we need to now do is first set our agent. So if you remember, I told you to remember the label that was assigned to that agent. In our case, we had called it Jenkins agent. This needs to match the name of the label that you had created when we had set up Jenkins earlier. So the first thing that we need to do is we actually need to install a few tools. Since our application is rather based on Java, and we're going to build it using Maven, we need to install the Java and Maven tools for it to be able to build. So let's save this file for a second and head back over into our Jenkins UI. So from here, what we need to do is we need to install a couple of plugins. So let's head into Manage Jenkins. Under Manage Plugins, we want to search for Maven. And then here you can see that we're provided with a list of options. The two that we're going to use are Maven integration, as well as the Pipeline Maven integration. And then the next plugin that we need to search for is Java. So if we search for Java, we can see it might be a better one to search for. Actually, instead of searching for Java, let's search for Yum. And then here we can see the Eclipse Tamarin installer. So let's go ahead and download and install after restart. So again, this may take a few moments. You can see that it is installing. And then what we'll do is we will restart when Jenkins is complete. So while that installs and restarts, we can head back into our pipeline and start configuring it here. So we'll talk about what these labels are in a second when we set it up. But in preparation, let's go ahead and add the tools that we're going to use. So to do that, we need to create a tools section. And what we'll do here is we're going to create two different tools, one for Java and one for Maven. So the first is the JDK that we're going to use. And we're going to use Java 17. Now this Java 17 is a label that we'll specify within our UI here in a second. The next thing is the Maven version. So let's do Maven, and we're going to call that one Maven 3. So let's save that and head back into our UI. So see if Jenkins, it's still pending. So let's continue with our pipeline build. So the first thing that we need to do is we need to understand how the pipeline works. The pipeline is broken down into stages, and each set of stages has a stage within it. We're just going to use a single stage at this point. And we're going to use multiple stages within a single set of stages. So it's not a multi-stage pipeline. I know that's a little bit confusing, but in some advanced videos, we'll get into multi-stage pipelines as well. So the first thing that we need to do is we should always start with a clean workspace. So let's go ahead and clean up our workspace. So we'll call this cleanup workspace. And then each stage contains a step. And then within a step is what it is that you want to do. So here, what we're going to do is we're going to actually use a built-in function that comes with Jenkins called clean WS. And clean WS will clean our workspace. And once we've done that, the next thing that we would want to do is we would want to check out our code from our source code repository. In order to do that, we'll need some credentials. So since our repository is private, we'll need to create a username and password. Now remember, you can't use your password directly. You need to go ahead and create a personal access token. So that's outside of the scope of this, but it's quite straightforward. If you do a quick search for Google, GitHub, personal access token, it'll show you how to very quickly create one of those. So what we'll do is we'll build the stage out first, and then we'll go back and create that token. So once we've cleaned up, let's take a copy of the stage, and then we'll add another stage directly below it. But this time what we're going to do is we're going to check out our code. So let's check out from SCM. And for our steps, what we're going to do here is we're going to use the main branch. So to do this, we need to use git branch. And then we need to select the branch that we're going to use, which is main. And then we need to use a credential helper. So to do that, you do credential ID. And then what we need to do is specify the ID that we're going to create. So in our case, it's going to be, let's call it GitHub, just so we can remember what that is. And then we'll need to specify the URL of the project. So it's probably easier if we just go back in here and copy that. And then that's it. So what this does is it tells us that we're going to check out the main branch using a credential that we'll create here in a second called GitHub. And we're going to check out this repository that we've specified here. So let's save that, and let's see if our Jenkins is back. And Let's give this a refresh. And it looks like Jenkins is back. So let's sign back in again. Now, the first thing that we need to do is we need to configure the plugins that we just installed. So let's go back into Manage Jenkins. We'll head into Global Configuration Tools. And then let's search for Maven. So we actually want the second one here. And we need to add Maven. We'll give it a name. So this is the name that needs to match what we created in our pipeline here. So Maven 3. And then what we're going to do is we're going to install this from Apache, and you can select a specific version. We'll just go with the latest version of 3.9.1, and then we'll hit apply. And let's save that. Now, if we head back again into Global Configuration Tools, we'll need to also configure Java. So let's go here and search for JDK. And under JDK, we want to do the same thing. So let's click on Add JDK. And again, we want to make sure that we use the same name. So let's copy what we'd set up in our pipeline, in our case, Java 17. And then we can leave the Java home blank. And what we want to do is we want to install automatically, and we're going to use the adoptium.net, and we're going to select version 17. And then we can hit apply and save. So now we've configured the tools that we're going to use. Now, there are other workarounds. Some people prefer to install Java and Maven directly onto their agents. This is just another option. I prefer to use this approach, but there is a lot of flexibility with how you can do this. So before we run this pipeline, what we need to do is we need to make sure that we set up this GitHub credential. So let's go back into Jenkins. Let's go into Manage Credentials. And then we're going to add a new credential. And this will be a SSH with username and password. But remember here, you cannot just use your password. You have to use the personal access token that was created in GitHub. I've already gone ahead and done that. This is just a temporary token. I'll delete this after this video is complete so I can share that on the screen. And then we're going to call this GitHub, which is what we referenced in our pipeline. So let's make sure we get the spelling correct here. And we'll match that description. So again, very quickly, make sure that you use a personal access token here and not the password, otherwise it will not work. So let's go ahead and create that so we can see that that has now been created. So the next thing that we need to do is we need to set up an actual pipeline. So let's create a new pipeline. And what I like to do is I like to just name the pipeline the same as the application. Again, this can be anything that you would like it to be. But in our case, I'm going to just use the application name or the GitHub repo in this case. And it's going to be a pipeline. We hit OK. There are a couple of things that we want to set up here just to make sure that we clean up after ourselves. So let's discard our old builds, and we only want to keep 2 of them. Again, in production, you may have some requirements that say that you need to keep a certain amount of builds, but since this is a tutorial, we're just going to create, or rather keep 2 days worth of builds. And then what we're going to do here is, for the pipeline, we're actually going to use our pipeline from our repository. And then here we can select Git. And then we now need to specify our repo URL or repository URL. So let's copy that and paste that in here. And you can see that it's going to complain that it's not authenticated. It doesn't support password as the authentication, but we've already created credentials using a personal access token. So let's go in here and select GitHub. And once we do that, we can see that everything is okay. Also, make sure that you match the correct branch. In our case, it is being pushed into the main branch. And then that's all you need to specify. We're going to call our file Jenkins files we created in our repository. So let's save and apply that. Now we need to commit that into our repository. So let's head back in. Let's add. And then what we need to do is commit. So we added our Jenkins file. Again, best practice is to make sure that you use messages that you can refer to in the future. It may make sense today, but if you come back and look at this code or you need to revert something in the future, it's always helpful for you to create messages that, that make sense. So now that we've done that, let's go ahead and push this up. And that should just take a moment. And once it's complete, we should be able to execute that pipeline. So let's head back into our Jenkins and let's build now. We can see that the build just started, and let's look at the console output so we can follow along. Okay, so it looks like we've got some typos in here. So this is great. So let's troubleshoot what's actually happening here. So it looks like we've got multiple instances of stages. Okay, so it looks like we've got some error in our pipeline. Let's go back and take a look. And indeed, we can see what's happened here, right? So what we've done is when I copied the previous stage for the checkout of the SCM, I copied the full block. So what we want to actually do is we need to nest our stages inside of stage. We need to nest our stage inside of stages. So in order to fix that, let's go ahead and let's remove this. And then we're going to remove this guy as well. So now we can see that this stage completes here. And this one matches correctly. And then this one matches. So we should now be good. So the first thing we'll do is we'll clean up our workspace. And then our second stage will be to check out our branch. So let's make sure that this works. Let's save. Let's add. Commit. And again, a helpful message. Let's push. Okay, so let's see what happens this time. So let's build it now. So let's take a look at our console output this time. And the first time it may take just an extra minute or two because it is going to go ahead and fetch the version of JDK and Maven that we'd specified. And you can see that that's already happened. We're now doing a checkout. And this should finish in a second. Again, I'm leaving this unedited. I'd like to, go through all the troubleshooting steps. Nothing is ever flawless. So there are a lot of YouTube videos out there where everything just seems to work, but we know in reality that's not the case. So it's good to understand how to troubleshoot some of these issues. So let's see here. We're almost done. Okay, so it's cloning the repository, and then we've got a finished success. So if we go back and look here, we can now see that our stage is executed as expected. Great. So now if we go back and take a look at our pipeline that we're building, what we've done so far is we've pushed our code to the application repository. We've started building our Jenkins user interface and the agent. So the next thing that we need to do is we now need to build the application itself and execute some tests. So to do that, we're going to need to create two more stages, a stage for build and a stage for test. So let's go back into our editor. And this time, let's make sure that we copy the right stage. And what we're going to do is we're going to add two more stages. So here, what we're going to do is we're going to build application. And we're going to test application. Now, since this is a Java application, the first thing that we'll need to do to build the application is we'll need to run a shell script that is going to do an mvn clean package. And then to test, what we need to do is we need to run a shell script. And here we will do mvn test. So as you can see, we've just copied the previous stage twice. We're going to now clean the package and build it. And then we're going to run a test. So let's save. Let's commit that code. First of all, we need to add the changes. So we added our build and test stage. And then let's push that back up again. Okay, so now we should be able to run this pipeline again by hitting build now. We can see that the job has started. Let's follow along inside of the console. Again, it's completely normal for there to be problems arise as you're going through building out your pipeline. The important thing is to learn from your troubleshooting steps. So the next time that you do it, you have a sense of what you did wrong the first time, and you'll probably make the same mistake over and over again, but it'll cut down on the amount of time that it takes for you to troubleshoot. So here you can see that it is now running its tests and it has finished. So if we go back and take a look, we can see the two new stages that were introduced. So we've built the application and we've tested the application. Great, so now we're making some progress. And what is the next thing that we need to do? So the next thing that we need to do in our pipeline is we've now successfully built and tested. We want to do some static code analysis. And we're going to use a tool called Sonarqube to do this. So let's go ahead and set up Sonarqube. I actually have a tutorial here that walks us through how to set up Sonarqube. Okay, so in the tutorial, we can see here there's an install Sonarqube. I'm going to be installing this on its own virtual machine. You may have already done this, so feel free to go ahead and skip these steps, but I'm going to keep mentioning I want to go through a complete hands-on tutorial, so we'll do this from scratch. So in my case, I have a third virtual machine that I have created. So let's sign into that, that virtual machine, and it is running on IP12. And then we can very quickly just copy and paste these commands. So let's update our virtual machine. And we're going to run Sonarqube with Postgres. There's a couple of different options. I've chosen to use Postgres. This is not a tutorial specifically about Sonarqube. I do have some separate videos if you're interested in learning more about it. So let's go ahead and add in the Postgres repository. And just like before, we do not have wget installed, so let's go ahead and install that first. Okay, so now that that's installed, we should be able to run through these commands. So we're going to go ahead and update and install Postgres, and we'll enable it. Okay, so while that's installing, let's look at the next step. So the next thing that we need to do is we need to set up a database for Sonarqube to talk to. So to do that, we're going to need to set the password for the Postgres user, which we just created in our prior step. So let's go ahead and set a password. Remember this password because you will need it in the future. The next thing we need to do is we need to become the Postgres user. And then now we're going to set up the actual database itself. So first, let's create the user. And then we're going to sign into the database. And then we're going to execute these commands. So again, all this is doing is it is granting privileges to that user Sonar, to this database Sonarqube. Once we've done that, we can exit out of the database. And then we can also exit out of the Postgres user. So now we need to install Java again. So we're already root. So let's go ahead and just like we did before, we'll use the Tamarin version of Java, and we're going to use JDK 17. Sonarqube is particular, so please pay attention to the version of Java that you're installing here. So let's go ahead and install this version. And while that installs, let's go ahead and take a look at some additional configuration that needs to happen. So there is some kernel tuning that needs to happen for Sonarqube to perform optimally. And I've gone ahead and just created some documentation here that talks about the limits that we need to change for Sonarqube to run. So we'll just go ahead and execute these commands. We're not going to dive into each one of these specifics. Just know that you do need to do this in order for Sonarqube to run. So the first thing that we're going to need to do is we're going to need to make some limits changes. So let's edit the file, and we can just go all the way to the bottom, and then we'll paste in these values. The next thing that we need to do is we need to increase our mapped memory regions, and we can do that by editing this particular file. And again, just go all the way to the bottom, and then we need to paste in this value, and then we can save that. And then let's go ahead and reboot our virtual machine just so that those take effect permanently. So that'll just take a moment to reboot, and then let's take a look at what the next steps are going to be. So what we'll do is we'll download and extract Sonarqube. I've already got the latest version here. So at the time of this recording, the latest version is 9.9. We'll create a user, we'll set some permissions, and then we'll update the Sonarqube properties to make sure that it can talk to the database. Okay, so let's go back. Our virtual machine should have rebooted by now, which it has. Let's go ahead and become root. And then here what we need to do is just copy these commands. So this is going to download the version of Sonarqube, extract it, it'll move it into the opt directory structure, and then it'll set the, we'll then need to set the appropriate permissions after we create a user for Sonar. So let's go ahead and copy this command. So now if we go into opt and we take a look, we can see that the Sonarqube application has been extracted and the permissions have been set correctly. So we now need to make sure that Sonarqube uses the appropriate database that we'd set up. So let's go ahead and edit the properties file. So again, I'm moving through this a little bit quickly because I do have dedicated videos on this, but I did want to include it in this video because it is an important part of the process. So here we're going to copy the settings. If you recall earlier, we just created a user called Sonar and we set the password to be Sonar. We're using Postgres, which is also running on this virtual machine. And by default, Postgres runs on port 5432, and the database that we're using is Sonarqube. So let's copy that. We want to find the section here where it says database, and then we can either uncomment and fill in the username and password, or you can just copy and paste the configuration from the documentation. So let's do that. The next thing that we need to do is we need to create a service so that Sonarqube starts and stops with our virtual machine. So let's create a service called Sonar. And again, I've already gone ahead and created the values that you need to use here. So let's copy this. Let's paste those values. And then we just need to simply start Sonar. We'll enable it, and then we'll check on the status. So let's go ahead and do that. So you can see that it is started, we've enabled it, and we can see that Sonarqube service is now actively running. Now, just because it's actively running doesn't mean that it's fully online yet. We can take a look at that by watching the log files. So the log files are written into the opt Sonarqube logs directory. So let's take a look at the logs here, and we can tail along and we can see that it looks like it is still coming up. So Sonarqube by default runs on port 9000. So what we can do is we can now go over to our browser and go to the IP address of the virtual machine and access port 9000. And you can see that Sonarqube is up and all systems are operational. So let's go ahead and click on, let's change that and actually go back in again. This time it'll prompt us for our username and password. So by default, the username and password is admin and password. Admin, and then it'll ask us to change the password. So the old password is admin. Let's set a secure password. So again, we are going to expose this to the internet in my case. Most organizations may not choose to do so. You may still want to configure a domain name with an SSL certificate, but then have some firewall rules that only allow you to access it internally. But that's outside of the scope of this. So in my case, it'll just be directly exposed, and I'm going to tear this down as soon as this tutorial is complete anyway. So let's go ahead and complete our password, and we can see that we now have Sonarqube up and running. So great. So now that we have Sonarqube, there are a couple of things that we need to set up for Jenkins to be able to send the application's code to Sonarqube for analysis. So the first thing that we need to do is we need to set up an API key. So to do that, we go into the top right corner under Administrator. We can go into My Account. We can go into Security, and then Generate a Token. So create a token that's friendly here. But before we do that, let's go ahead and actually set up a reverse proxy so that we can access this through a domain name, through a secure URL. And if we head back into the documentation, you can see I've got that laid out here. It's an optional step, but you will want to do this, especially if you want to use a webhook in the future where it doesn't really like you to use the same machine for the webhook. Again, that's outside of the scope of this, but let's just go ahead and very quickly run through this. It will just take a few seconds. So we're going to install Nginx. We're going to create a config file. And I've already gone ahead and created the config file that's necessary. So this is really just proxying all requests that come in to localhost port 9000, and it's going to listen on this domain. So please make sure you update the domain name. Whoops. Let's write and save that. We want to then create a symbolic link to make sure that it's enabled. We'll test the configuration, and if all looks good, we can restart Nginx. So it looks like everything is good. Let's restart Nginx. And now we should be able to hit our Sonarqube installation on HTTP without needing to go to a port, and we can see that we need to do that, but it's not secure. So let's go ahead and quickly install a certificate. To do that, we need to install certbot again, so we can copy the command, and then we just need to create our certificate again. For the domain, make sure that you choose a domain that matches one that you have configured within your environment. So let's do that. We will need to enter our email address again. Accept the services. We can say no to sending our data. And then in just a moment, you will see that it will return the certificate, install it into Nginx, and then we should have a secure access into our Sonarqube setup. So we can see that it's cleaning up the challenges, deployed the certificate, and everything now looks good. So if we head back, and then this time what we'll do is let's close this tab, and let's go to HTTPS, and we can see that Sonarqube is now running on a secure port. So let's sign in with our new password that we had set. And then let's get back to creating that API key. So as I was explaining earlier, to do that, we go into the administrator's account. So in the top right, My Account, Security, Generate a Token. Give it a friendly name so that you can recognize it. We'll call this the name of our Jenkins server. So you can select the token type. In our case, we'll go ahead and just use a global analysis token, and we'll set this to no expiration and generate that token. Now it's important this token is only shown once, so if you leave this page, this token will disappear. So let's go ahead and copy that token. We'll store that token in a notepad for now. And then we'll create a secret. So let's head back into Jenkins. Let's go into Dashboard, Manage Jenkins. We want to manage credentials. And then let's add a credential. And this time we're going to create a secret text. So here we need to paste the contents of our token. So let's copy that and paste that here. And then here you need to create an ID that you will reference in your pipeline. So let's go ahead and just call this Jenkins Sonarqube token. And then we'll use the same for the description as well. Great. So now we have the credential set up. We've got Sonarqube, and there is a couple of plugins that we need to install so that the application can send its code over for analysis. So if we head back into our Jenkins, we want to go under Manage Jenkins. We want to go back to Manage Plugins. Under Available Plugins, let's search for Sonarqube. And what we're going to install is we're going to install the Sonarqube scanner. And then if you actually search for quality gates, we want to install the Sonar quality gates. We'll install quality gates. And what this will allow us to do is it'll allow us to pause or block the build if it doesn't pass its analysis. So let's go ahead and install after restart. So this should just take another few moments. So while that's happening, let's go ahead and start setting up our pipeline. So we can see that everything is downloaded. Let's restart Jenkins and then go back into our pipeline and add an additional stage for the Sonarqube analysis. So once we've tested the application, the next thing that we need to do is create a new stage. So we can just simply copy this stage block. Let's paste that here. And then we can call this something that's recognizable. So in our case, we'll just say Sonarqube analysis. And then in order to do this, we need to make sure that we use Sonarqube with its credentials. And then there's a Maven command that allows us to run the tests. So the command to run is very simple. It's just mvn sonar:\sonar. But right now it's not passing any credentials, so this will fail. So what we need to do is we need to make sure that we do this with credentials. So let's go ahead and create another line here that reads with Sonarqube env. And this reminds me, we do need to set up Sonarqube, so we'll do that here in a second. And then we need to do credentials ID, and then we need to specify the token, which we called Jenkins Sonarqube token. Okay, so that looks good. And then we do need to add an additional curly bracket here, which we need to close here. So let's indent this to get the spacing correct. So, and I always like to make sure that we've got the appropriate amount of open and close brackets. So if we click here in Visual Studio Code, you can see that this closes the entire stage. This wraps around the steps, and this wraps around the environment variable. So let's take another quick look here just to make sure I don't have any spelling mistakes. So it's with Sonarqube env credentials ID, and that is the correct token that we are using. Okay, perfect. So let's save that. And Jenkins has restarted, so let's sign back in. So we installed the plugin, but we didn't configure it. So let's go back into Manage Jenkins. Let's go into Configure System. And I always forget, it may be under Global Configuration Tool, but let's take a look. Let's search for, oh, it is under Configure System, so that's great. Okay, so under Sonarqube servers, it's very important that we check environment variables, and then we need to add a scanner. So let's go in here and give this a name. So let's call this Sonarqube scanner. So this will download the actual scanner binary. And then we need to specify the URL for our Sonarqube system. So in our case, since we used a reverse proxy, we can copy this URL. Now in your case, you may have chosen not to do that. So in that case, make sure that you specify either the IP address or localhost followed by the port. Now we had already set up this authentication token. So if we select the dropdown, we can use the authentication token and we can hit apply. Okay, now there is one more. So that I misspoke. That was setting up the actual scanner. So if we now go back into Manage Jenkins, and we go into Global Configuration Tool, let's also search for Sonar here. So here we do need to install the scanner. So before we were just setting up the location of Sonar. So here what we need to do is we need to add Sonarqube. We can call this Sonarqube scanner, and we'll just call it latest. We're going to install it from Maven since we're going to use the mvn command to execute this, and then we can apply, save. Now these are just warnings. There's nothing that we can do about them. It does tell us that some credentials may be transmitted in plain text. If you don't like seeing these, we can remove them. Since this is a complete DevOps pipeline, I may as well go ahead and show you how to do that. So here you can go ahead and just click on configure which warnings are shown. It'll redirect you to this page. And then if we scroll down just a little bit here, it'll ask us under hidden security warnings, which warnings we want to be notified about. So I'm okay to accept these. Again, this is personal preference. I just don't like to see the big red on the screen. But certainly before you do that, I would encourage you to read the security advisories to understand what it is that's happening here. But let's save and apply. And that should take care of the warning messages for us. So if we take a look at that pipeline one more time, we're now going to tell it to do the analysis. We've got the right credentials, hopefully. So let's go ahead and commit this and give it a test. So what we need to do is we need to go back to our machine where our source code is, which is here. So let's add, let's commit. And then we can push this. And if all is well, we should be able to now run this pipeline. And monitor the console output. And it looks like we made a typo here. So credentials ID. So I think that is a typo. So let's go back and take a look here. What did we do here? So if we line 40, okay, so let's take a look. With Sonarqube env credential. make sure we type this correctly. Credentials, capital ID. So that looks correct. And we can save that. And there's one other way we can quickly validate the syntax. So let me actually show you that. So if we go back into our Jenkins and we go into the main pipeline, we can click on this pipeline syntax. So let's open it in a new tab. And then let's search for Sonarqube in here. So with Sonarqube and prepare environments. So we're going to use this token. Let's generate that pipeline. Could not find any tokens. Could not find any credentials with ID Jenkins. Okay, so let's see what is going on here. Let's go back into our dashboard. Manage Jenkins. Let's take a look at our credentials. So we do have our token here, which we've got as a secret text. And it is saying that it cannot find it. Okay, so let's troubleshoot what's happening here. Before we do that, let's actually just copy the generated pipeline. Make sure that we didn't make a spelling mistake. So let's go into Visual Studio Code here. Okay, so it looks like that is correct. I have a suspicion that we need to change the type of token or key that we created. So let's go back in here again. And it says that it cannot find any credentials. So if we now go back, let's delete this token, or this credential rather. And then what we can do is let's go back under credentials. Let's add a new credential. And let's use a secret text, which I believe is the right one, but let's go in back over here and just copy it and recreate it. So let's Jenkins token. And then we still have this here, luckily, and we also did copy and paste it, so we did have that saved. But let's go ahead and recreate that secret and see what's going on here. So if we go back into our pipeline token, let's just remove that for a second. Let's now select. Okay, so I'm not sure why it's giving us that warning, but let's go ahead and try to run our pipeline again. So let's go back into Manage Jenkins, sorry, Dashboard, Pipeline, let's build it now. And these are some of the troubleshooting steps that you'll end up having to go through. And we can see here that it's already failed again. So let's take a look a little bit more closely at that message. So and we did create that key. Let's make sure that we configured everything correctly. So let's go back into our configure system. Let's search for Sonarqube. So we can see that let's uncheck. Okay, so we know that that is correct. We have this checked. You don't need to specify any additional arguments. So let's actually change this to server for a second. This should not make a difference, but we're just troubleshooting what's happening here. So let's go back into global tool configuration. Let's look for Sonarqube. And we do see that that is correct. Let's change this name to scanner. Okay, and then I do want to just take a look at the pipeline again. So let's just make sure we're doing this correctly. So with Sonarqube, okay, so we copied that. We know that that is correct. Let's make sure there was no difference there. Okay, so there was. So let's add, let's commit and push. And let's go and rebuild that. There could have been a typo that I just did not see when I copy and paste it. So let's go ahead and build it again. Okay, so it is still failing. Let's see. Multiple compilation errors. I don't think this makes a difference, but let's try adding this in a script tag. So let's make sure we close these correctly. We've got that one. That's correct. And we'll tab these out. So that can go there. Now I don't think this will make a difference, but let's try. Okay, I think that was it. So I think since we're adding multiple lines inside of our Jenkins file, we need to wrap it inside of a script. So that's an important lesson. So again, troubleshooting as we're doing this live, we found out that we need to wrap this inside of a script. So let's see if that actually now completes to succession. So it looks like it is testing the application. We're running through the Sonarqube analysis now. And then hopefully this will finish in just a few moments. And since we know the token is correct, let's go back to our main Sonarqube page. And once this finishes, it should now post the results into our Sonarqube, which it has done. And we can see here that has passed. Okay, all right. So again, like I said, I'm doing this live, no editing. So I'll keep this all in the video so you can hopefully learn from some of the mistakes or some of the oversights that I've been making here. Okay, great. So let's go back and continue. So if we go back and look, we've done our static code analysis, but but we haven't introduced a quality gate. So let's go ahead and introduce a quality gate. What that means is if the project doesn't pass, we can block the deployment. In order to do that, you do need to have a webhook that can respond back to Jenkins. To do that, we need to set up our webhook. So let's go into administration. Let's go into, actually it's right under configuration, webhooks. There's no webhook defined, so let's create one. We'll give it a name, and then the URL that we need to pass back. So here it's important. So in our case, this is where our Jenkins is installed. And then you need to add Sonarqube-webhook, and it's very important that you include the trailing slash. We're not going to use any secrets. So let's go ahead and create that webhook. Now we can go back into our Jenkins file, and let's add an additional stage. So let's make sure we copy the previous stage. And then here what we can do is we can add a quality gate. And then in order to do this, we'll leave our script in. And by the way, just as a side note, there's no harm in wrapping everything in a script, even if you're just executing a single shell command. So we can leave that in here. And what we're going to do here is we want to wait for quality gate. So let's change this. And we don't need that additional bracket. So, but here what we're going to do is we're going to wait for quality gate. And then we want to abort the pipeline is false. So we'll continue. It'll just report back in our case. We're going to use the credentials that we had specified earlier. So let's go ahead and just copy the same credentials. Now there are some additional options in here. So again, we're not going to abort the pipeline. We're just going to report back the status. So let's just very quickly take a look at this. So we're going to wait for quality gate. We're going to not abort the pipeline. Our credential is as specified. So this time, let's save and see if we got it right the first time. So let's add, and then let's commit this. So we'll add the quality gate check. Let's push that code. And then let's build this again. So hopefully you guys are learning or finding this useful. We are building a complete pipeline, so apologies for this being a long video, but you certainly can pause this and come back to it at a later point if it's getting a little bit long. But I do want to make sure that I keep all the troubleshooting as part of this video, because I think a lot of people will find this useful. All right, so let's watch our pipeline. So it's going through its Sonarqube analysis. And we can see it's now doing a quality gate. And as you can see, it has passed. So now we can see that the quality gate is passed. If we refresh this page, we can actually now see that it's reported directly under this pipeline. So we get the results of our quality gate. Now, if we didn't create that webhook, what would have happened is it would have just hung or stayed on that stage because it would have been waiting for a response to come back from Sonarqube. So it's very important to make sure that that webhook is configured. If you do find that your pipeline is hanging or appears to be stuck, that could be one of the reasons why. Great. So now let's go back and take a look at our pipeline here. So we've already gone through, we've built and test, we've done our Sonarqube, we've introduced our pipeline. The next thing that we want to do is we want to now build and push our Docker container. So in order to do that, let's go ahead and install some plugins. Okay, so let's head back into Jenkins, and under Manage Jenkins, we want to install some plugins that'll help us build and push our Docker container. So under available plugins, we want to search for Docker. And here we're going to select a few plugins. So we're going to select Docker, Docker Commons, Docker Pipeline, Docker API, Docker Build Step, and then finally the Docker Build and Push. So let's download and install after restart. So we can go ahead and check this, and while the plugins install, let's go ahead and start preparing our pipeline. So if we head back into our Visual Studio Code, there are a few environment variables that we're going to use to help us build the container. And these are, again, some best practices. Organizations may vary, but I like to set this up so that we can have an appropriate way to version and tag our applications. So the first thing that we'll do is let's go ahead and introduce some environment variables. So under the tools section, what we want to do is let's go ahead and add some environments. And what we're going to do is there are a few that we're going to add. So the first is we'll create a variable called app name. And we're going to set the app name equal to the application name that we're building. So in our case, I'm going to just use this here, which is the name of the Git repository or the application itself. So we'll call our application complete production end-to-end pipeline. We'll also create a release, and we'll use this in the Docker build stage here, as you'll see in a second. So let's start this with version 1.0.0, and then we'll append the tags to this release version. We can then set our Docker user. So again, make sure that you change this to match your Docker Hub username. So in my case, I am going to use my Docker username, and then we can set a Docker password. We'll just call it Docker pass to make it a little bit shorter. In this case, what we'll do is we're going to actually create this as a secret because we don't want to leave this in our public repo. So here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to say that the Docker pass environment variable is equal to a secret that is called Docker Hub. And we'll set that up here in a second. Next, what we'll do is we'll create a format for our image name. So let's say our image name is going to follow a specific pattern. So what we'll do here is we'll say that the image name is going to be our Docker username. So in this case, it'll be Docker user. So to do that, what we need to do is we need to specify it inside of these curly parentheses. So Docker user. And then it'll also be the Docker user. So in this case, that'll be daemon cloud, as you can see here. And then we're going to add a slash, which is the format that's required by Docker Hub. And then we're going to add the app name. So to do that, we do just like we did before. So we'll do $, and then inside of the curly parentheses, it's the app _ name. So our image name should be, in this case, Docker user, which is daemon cloud / and then the app name, which will be this. So again, hopefully this makes sense. This is really just building out some environment variables so that we can use them later on. But it's following the Docker Hub standard for naming. And then the next thing that we need to do is we need to create an image tag. So this image tag will be changing later on once we update it inside of our second pipeline. But for now, what we're going to do is we're going to say our image tag is equal to, and then we're going to say it's the release. So, and let's just copy and paste this because there's definitely room for error here. So it's going to be the release followed by the build number. Now the build number is something that is a Jenkins environment variable. So for example, build 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and you can see that here. If we just very quickly jump in, and I can show you what the build number is. Again, I just want to be very thorough so you have a full understanding of what is happening. So once we go into the pipeline here, our build number are these build numbers. So in our case, when we create our image tag, it's going to be our release, which will be 1.0.0, and then dash, and then the build number. And then we want to make sure that we put that inside of quotes. So let me just double check that syntax to make sure that there's no mistakes, and I'm sure that there probably will be. So let's see, release. Okay, so that does look good. Let's make sure that we've got our parentheses closed correctly here. So it looks like there's a mismatch. So let's figure out what's happening here. So we know that that one's correct. That's correct. That looks good. And we do not need that double quote there. So now we can see that everything lines up as expected. And I wouldn't be surprised if there's some problems here, but let's go through it and we'll troubleshoot if anything comes up. Okay, so now that we've defined some of our environment variables, let's go ahead and create our Docker image and then push it up into GitHub. Into Docker Hub itself. But before we do that, let's save this, and we do need to create a token before we forget. So let's go ahead and go into Manage Jenkins, Manage Credentials, and then this time we'll add a new credential, username and password, and then this is your Docker Hub sign-in. So again, just like with GitHub, we want to make sure that we create an API token that can be used as a password. I've already gone ahead and done that. It's very straightforward. You can just search on Google how to create an API token outside of the scope of this video, but you've probably done that before. So since I've already gone ahead and done that, let me just copy what I have. Again, I'm going to delete these tokens as soon as this tutorial is complete, so it's okay if you see them. And then let's match the ID. So if we go back and we take a look, we said that we were going to call it Docker Hub. So let's go back and create that new credential. Okay, great. So now that we've done that, we can go back and actually start working on our Docker build stage. So let's copy this. And then let's call this stage our build and push Docker image. Okay, so since we installed those plugins, there's a couple of shortcuts. Again, if you look at different YouTube videos, you may see some different ways of this being done. These are just the steps that I prefer to use when building and pushing a Docker container. I just find it to be very straightforward. So in our case, what we need to do is we need to tell it that we're going to use Docker with registry. And since we're using just regular Docker Hub, and then we can pass it our Docker pass, which is our Docker password that we defined earlier. And then here, what we need to now do is we need to say our Docker image is equal to, and we're going to do a Docker build. And then this is where we can start using those environment variables. So before we had created this called image name, and then we finish that stage there. So once that's finished, the next thing that we need to do is to push it. So let's go ahead and create another Docker with registry, and I'm making sure that I get these the spelling correct here. And then what we need to do is again use our Docker pass, which is an environment variable that we had defined earlier. And then this time what we're going to do is we're going to do a Docker image push, because this time we want to push it, and we want to push it with the tag that we had generated. So let's go with image underscore tag. And we need, I think we're missing some quotes here. So this needs to be wrapped inside of double quotes. Okay. So let me just take a quick look at that again. So we are going to push it and the image tag. So I think I've got my quotes in the right place. So this will push it with the image tag that we're generating based on what we used in our environment variables before. But you may also want to just retag the latest build as the latest tag. So you can do that by simply doing a Docker image push, and then you can just tag this with latest as well. Now again, you probably won't deploy with latest in production use cases, but this way you know that the latest build will always have the latest tag as well. So give that one quick look through. Everything seems to be okay, but if not, we will troubleshoot. So let's save that. Let's go ahead and commit. Let's commit our changes. So added Docker build and push. And then let's trigger that pipeline again. So let's go back in here. We'll build. And then while that's building, let's go into Docker Hub, and you'll see that that repository does not actually exist. So if I sign in, you can see I've got a complete DevOps pipeline that I pushed to 2 days ago, but we don't see our complete end-to-end pipeline. So if all is successful, it should create a new repository with the tag and push it up here. So let's see what happens. Let's go back. We can see that it's going through our testing of the application. It's doing our Sonarqube analysis, and we can actually follow along inside of the console just in case there's any errors that pop up. And we do have a error message. Okay, so let's see. So it is saying that it has failed to... It would be helpful if we had created a Docker file. So in this case, what we forgot to do is we actually forgot to build or rather create a Docker file. So there is no Docker file for it to build, which makes sense. All right, so let's go back into our Visual Studio Code, and then we need to create a Docker file. So these are the things that you will probably run across as you're building your pipelines. There's just a lot to remember. So, okay, so this is a Java application. So what we'll do is we'll use a multi-stage build process, and we'll build it first, and then we'll package it up. So let's see. So what we're going to do is we'll use the Maven image, and we'll use version 3.9.0. Again, you probably want to check with your developers to see if there's any specific versions that they want to use. Since this is just a quick example, we'll just use the 3.9.0, and what we'll do is we'll just go ahead and use the Tamarin 17, and we'll do this since we're going to do multi-stage as build. Again, I'm not getting into the specifics of the actual Docker file here. If that is something that you're interested in learning more about in detail, I'm more than happy to create some additional content. So please just leave a comment below, and I'll certainly help you with that. So here we're going to set our work directory to app, and then we're going to copy everything into that working directory, and then we're just going to do a simple mvn, and then this time we'll do a clean install. So that'll build our package. And then the second stage, what we want to do is let's again use our Eclipse. We'll use the Tamarin. And I'm hoping I could just autocomplete here, but it's not Tamarin. And then we'll use version 17.0.6. And these are just versions that I've identified on Docker Hub. So if you're wondering where I'm coming up with these versions, I just happen to know that these are the versions that I want to use. Okay, and then once we've done that, we want to set our work directory to app, which is where everything is. And let's make sure we get that correct. And then what we would like to do is we need to copy from the build, and it's under app target, and the jar file that it builds is the demo app.jar. Now, again, I'm not getting into the specifics of the Java side of this, but this will be something that your developers can help you with. And we have a spelling mistake here because this should be from build. And we're going to copy it from the application's target, the demo app.jar, into app. And then we're going to expose the port. Again, by default, the port is 8080. And then we need to set a entry point. So what we'll do is we'll run Java. And then we'll do -jar. And then we need to specify the jar file itself. Okay, so let's take a look at that to see if it looks good. So we're going to execute the build. Okay, that looks good. But again, if there are any issues, we'll troubleshoot it live here. So let's go ahead and save that. So okay, so let's see what happens if we run that build now. Okay, so let's follow along in the console. And if there are other areas that you would like me to create any tutorials on, please feel free to leave some comments below. I'm always looking for content ideas. I did have a lot of requests for this particular tutorial to go through an end-to-end DevOps pipeline. So more than happy to create any additional content that you may feel is valuable. All right, so it looks like we're going through our Docker build stage here. So hopefully we got our syntax correct in the Jenkins file. The build is done. And then we should be on our way to pushing that container up into Docker Hub. So let's see what happens. Hopefully you guys are enjoying what you're seeing so far. You're finding it useful, something that you can use either in your day-to-day jobs or potentially as you're interviewing and looking at maybe starting a career in the DevOps world. Okay, so it looks like this has finished and is successful. So let's go ahead and look. You can see that everything passed. If we go into our Docker Hub and give it a refresh, we can see that it did indeed create the new repository. It was pushed just a few seconds ago, and we should see 2 tags. So here we can see exactly what we expected to see, which is the release, which we defined as version 1.0.0, the build number, which is 10, and then we also tagged it with the latest tag. So this is great. So everything so far is working as we expected it to. So let's move on and see what the next stage is. So we have a Trivy artifact scan that we can run Trivy against. What I might do, this video is getting a little bit long. If this is something that's important to you, just let me know and I'll update this video with this build step for now. But what we're going to do is let's just go ahead and move on to deploying this into our Kubernetes cluster. And in order to do that, we're going to need to set up 2 more virtual machines. One virtual machine that'll run Argo CD, another virtual machine that'll run Kubernetes. And let's go ahead and do that now. Okay, so just like before, I've got this documented. We'll quickly go through and set up our 2 additional servers. We'll go through this a little bit quickly just to move this video along, but I've got 2 tutorials here that explain how to get Argo CD installed, and then we'll just create a blank cluster for our Kubernetes cluster. So let's open up another shell prompt. So what we'll do is we'll open up a new terminal window, and we'll do 2 at the same time here so we can help move things along a little bit quickly. So let's sign into our Argo CD machine, and then on the right-hand side, we're going to build another cluster at the same time as well. So if we go back into our documentation, we'll just do a copy and paste, and I'll move through this pretty quickly. So let's update both virtual machines, and then we want to create a Kubernetes cluster. So here I'm just going to use K3s, which is a lightweight Kubernetes cluster. It'll install, we'll copy the config file, and we'll move that into our home directory so we can access the cluster itself. So let's just go ahead and very quickly copy this command here, and this will be the same for both our Argo CD setup as well as our cluster where we'll run the application. So let's go ahead and install that here, and I don't think the copy and paste worked correctly, so let's just run that again. Let's become root on this side. And we're disabling traffic. Traffic is an ingress controller, and we're going to actually just use Nginx for our setup. So you can see here that it's already installed, and the next thing that we need to do is we need to then create a folder for where our kubeconfig will reside. So let's go ahead and do this. So let's exit out of both of these. And then what we can do is just copy this block of code. And actually, I think there's a missing step here. So let's create the kube directory on both folders, and then we need to actually change into that directory. And I'll be sure to update the documentation by the time this video is released. So once we've changed into the directory, we can then just go ahead and copy these commands. And then now, just to test, we can do a kubectl get nodes, and we can see that this Argo CD cluster is up and running. And let's do the same on this machine. And over here, it's called app cluster. So the name of the cluster takes on the host name of the machine. And as you can see, I've created the host name of Argo CD cluster for this virtual machine and app cluster for this machine. Okay, so now that we've done that, let's go ahead and quickly get Argo CD installed. We're just going to deploy it using the manifest files. So let's copy and deploy Argo CD. And then what we're going to do is we're going to change it from cluster IP to node port. So once it's installed, we can use this patch command, and we'll edit the service to now be running as a node port. And then we can fetch the password. So this is the password that's going to be the default password that gets created for Argo CD. So let's copy that and save that over here. And then what we now want to do is let's go ahead and get everything set up for enabling with TLS and exposing it via an ingress controller. So in order to do that, we need to run, or rather install cert manager. So I will install cert manager. And again, I'm only doing this on the Argo CD node for now. So once the cert manager is installed, we'll need to create a cluster-wide issuer using Let's Encrypt. Again, this is outside of the scope of this video, but if you're interested, let me know in the comments below and I can dive into some more detailed videos on how this all works. So now that cert manager is installed, we're going to go ahead and create the issuer. If you're following along and copy and pasting, just make sure that you change your email address here. So let's save that and then let's apply that. So this will go ahead and create a cluster-wide issuer, and we can check that that's working by taking a look at the cluster issuer. So let's do a cluster issuer, and we can see that it's created and enabled. Great. So the next thing that we need to do is we need to install the Nginx controller. I'm just using the Nginx controller from Kubernetes and not doing anything special here. So let's just go ahead and apply that. Once that gets installed, we should now get an IP address that's mapped to the ingress, and we can check by doing a kubectl get ingress. And we can see that there's no resources that are found yet. Oh, rather, sorry, we didn't create an ingress. We need to check the services. So let's check the services. And we can see that the load balancer IP address is still pending, but that will just take a moment. And there we go. We can see that the load balancer has been created. And the next thing we need to do is we need to actually create an ingress to expose this. So I just took this directly from the Argo CD documentation, but I've included it in this guide just to make things easier. Again, if you copy and paste, just make sure that you update the references to the hosts that are defined here. So let's create a file called ingress. And then we can copy this. Whoops. Let's make sure that we do this correctly. And then we can apply that ingress. And then this time, if we do a get ingress, we'll see that it is trying to get a certificate from the Acme servers using cert manager. And this usually just takes about anywhere from 30 to 60 seconds. But if we just give this a few seconds, in fact, we can just put a watch in front of this, and we should see that this comes back, and there we go. So now we should be able to access our Argo CD using our hostname over a secure HTTPS connection. So let's go back into our browser, and then let's go and try and access our Argo CD. And there we go. We can see that Argo CD is up and running. It is indeed using a secure connection. So here we can sign in using that password that we had collected earlier. So I'm just going to go ahead and copy this, and I'm going to sign in. Perfect. So now we have a blank Argo CD. There are no applications, no Git repos, nothing has been set up yet. So there's a couple of things that we need to do. So the first thing that we need to do is let's go ahead and add that second cluster that we'd created. So in order to do that, we need to copy over our kubeconfig file and use that context to register with Argo CD. So again, just bear with me as I go through this. It may appear a little bit complicated, but hopefully it will make sense. So on this machine on the right-hand side, which is our application cluster, which is what we want to register with Argo CD, we need to take a look at the config file. So let's take the contents of this kube config file, and we're going to go to our host where Argo CD cluster is running, and we're going to create a new config here. We're going to call this Argo CD, app cluster, and then we'll paste the contents of that configuration in here. Now we need to change the IP address. This is the IP address that kubectl will talk to. So since we copied it from the local host of the app cluster, it won't work if we try to talk to it from the Argo CD cluster. So let's go ahead and let's change the IP address. And in my case, it is running on 192.168.1.20. And then we can save this. Now what we want to do is we want to export that kube config so that we can talk to the Argo CD cluster. So we can do that by doing export kube config .cube, and then we can specify the app cluster. And then let's make sure that that indeed worked as expected. So if we do a kubectl get nodes, we can see right now that it is using the Argo CD cluster. So that is incorrect. So what did we do wrong here? Did we made a typo in the kube config? Okay. So it's always good to check. So I'm glad that we did that. So now that we exported the right config file, we can see that we're now talking to the app cluster, which is where our application will be deployed. So let's go back and take a look at our installation notes here. So we can install the Argo CD command line utility, which will help us do a couple of things. We can change the password if we choose to do so, but it'll also help us register that cluster. So let's copy this, and then let's install the Argo CD command line utility. So this will fetch it from Argo's GitHub, and then it'll move it into the user local bin directory. So once we've done that, if you want to, you can go ahead and change the password. In my case, I'm just going to skip over that for saving some time. And then what we'll do is we'll actually just go ahead and register the cluster. So in order to do that, let's just do a quick search. So if we say Argo CD add cluster, and the top link here that comes up shows us the command that we need to enter. So basically we can just copy this. And there's some additional arguments that you can pass, like the name if you want to override the cluster name, which we will use. So let's copy this. And then what we want to do is we want to add, it's now the default context, and then we're going to call it, we're going to use the -- name, and then we're going to call this the apps cluster. And then it's going to ask us if we want to give it the privilege to do this. We'll say yes. It's going to create some cluster roles, a service account, some cluster role bindings. And let's see, why did that fail? Let's just make sure that that did not indeed create. Let's go into settings and take a look at clusters. Okay, so it didn't create it. Let's take a look. We must have made a typo here. Let's take a look at the documentation very quickly. What did we do here? Let's take a look at this one. So I think I'm missing. Okay, so what we need to do, let's actually take this because I think I may have typoed. Let's see. So the name is app cluster. Okay, so app cluster. And we need to make sure we specify the default context, which is what it is set as. So let's see, why is it telling me service address? Let's just make sure I've got the right context exposed here. So we do. Okay, so let's see what is going on. Let's take a look at that config. Make sure we've got the right context. Okay, so it is default. And when we try to do a... Oh, I know exactly what's going on. Again, this is what happens when you're doing a live tutorial. So what we didn't do is we did not sign in to Argo CD. So what we need to do is we need to do an Argo CD login, and then we need to log into our cluster. So before we do that, let's fetch that password again. And before we can do that, we need to switch our context back. So let's change our context back to the default, fetch the password, and then change our context back. Okay, so now what we need to do is we need to log in to argocd.dev.dman.cloud. Okay, so now that we've actually connected our CLI to the Argo CD instance, we should be able to now register. And there we go, it was added. So again, sometimes these small things will catch you off guard. But at least now we know that we're in business. Okay, so we can see that the app cluster has now been added with the correct IP address. So what we now need to do is we need to set up a secondary repository where we will create a deployment and a service manifest. And I've already gone ahead and done that. So if you take a look at my Git repo, I've created a repository that is called GitOps Complete End-to-End Production. And there are two manifest file, rather a deployment and a service file that are listed in here. So if we take a look at the deployment, you can see it's a very basic Kubernetes deployment file. Again, this is outside of the scope of this tutorial, but I would assume that you have a good idea of how to create these manifest files. And then here what I've done is I've created a placeholder that basically tells us the image, but then the change me. And this is what will get changed with all the tags. So what we need to do is clone this repository, and then let's just first make sure that the application deploys as we expect it to. So if I go back over here, and we no longer need to be over here, but we'll leave that window open. So let's go back to our host machine and go into the projects folder. And I've already cloned that repository. So let's edit the deployment file. And then let's just very quickly update this tag. So we've already pushed a version of an image that we built already. So let's go back into Docker Hub. And then let's take a look at what it was, right? So this is our image name and then the tag. So let's just make sure that we have set this name up correctly in our deployment here. And then we'll use this tag. Okay, and then bear with me because you'll see in a second in our Jenkins pipeline, we'll actually update this automatically through our build process. But for now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to add this and I'm going to commit it. And I've updated the image tag. So if we go back and take a look at our repository and we'll refresh this page, you'll see that it's now got the right tag in here. So let's go ahead and create a application. So before we can do that, we need to make sure that we specify the credentials for our GitHub repository inside of Argo CD. So let's go under settings, and then we'll go to repositories. We want to connect a repository. We're going to connect via HTTPS. I'm going to deploy it to the default namespace. And then we can take this URL directly from here. This is where our manifest files reside. Remember, this is a separate repository from our application. So let's go in here and create that repository. For the username, we want to use our username. And then just like we had to in Jenkins, we want to make sure that we use our personal access token to connect. So let's specify that and connect. And we can see that that's successfully connected. So now we can create an application. So let's create an application. We'll give it a name. So again, let's give it the same name as our application. So if we cat that deployment file, we'll call our application simply this. And again, you could use whatever you like here. And then we're going to deploy it into the default project. We're going to automatically sync this. We'll prune and self-heal. And we're going to get it from the repository that we just configured. We'll use the head. And then our files are all located in the root directory, so we can just do a /. And then here, we want to make sure we select the application cluster. So let's select the application cluster. We'll deploy it into the default namespace, and then we can just go ahead and create that. So once we do that, we can see that it's already starting to sync. If we click in, we'll see that it has started fetching our image and is deploying it. And while that's going through, we can actually take a look on the terminal and take a look at what's happening. So if we do a kubectl get pods, we can see that it is indeed pulling our container, and it's entering into a crash loop back off, but that could just be, let's see what's actually happening here. Let's take a look at the events. And we can take a quick look at this. So if we describe the pod, let's see why it is back off or starting. And it could just be because we don't have enough resources that are allocated, but let's take a quick look. Okay, so we'll do some more troubleshooting, and let's take a look at what's happening here. Let's take a look at the logs. Oh, it looks like when we built our container that we had a problem. It's unable to find the demo app.jar. So let's see what happened here. So if we go back to our project, so we expect it to create this demo app.jar. So let's take a look at where that actually is. So if we go back to our application, let's take a look at the complete project. Let's go to source. Target. So app target demo app.jar. So that is where it gets created. But when we built this, for some reason, it did not work. So let's take a look at this Docker file one more time. Make sure that we're building it correctly. And I already see the problem here. So the problem is it's app. So again, I'm glad that we took a look at that. So let's go back here and we can push that. So if we do a git status, we'll see that we modify the Docker file. So let's add that. Let's commit. Fixed typo in Docker file. And then let's push. And then we'll have to rebuild that again. So this is the beauty of live demos, where we're going through everything from the beginning and we can uncover any problems. But again, this is stuff that you'll run into as a DevOps engineer. So it's good that you see the troubleshooting steps and possible areas that you could run into any issues. So we know that this is now going to build. We can see that it's running build 11. So when this finishes, we can predict that our new container is going to have a tag of .11 as it gets pushed into Docker Hub. So let's go back and get that ready. So let's just go into here. Since we're doing this manually, let's go back into our GitOps repository. Let's edit that deployment, and we'll change our image name to 11. And then let's get this staged. So we updated the image tag. And then before we push it, let's just make sure that everything gets pushed up as expected. And this should just take a few more seconds. Okay, so it's almost done. And if we go into our Docker Hub, we'll see that the .11 tag has been pushed. So now let's commit that. Let's go back into Argo CD and let's do a sync. So this time, hopefully, we should be able to have a fully deployed application. And it looks like it is indeed. So if we go back and we can check our pods, and we can see that that is running, and then these will fail off as the other application comes online. So perfect. So we can give that a second. Everything will sync itself back up again here. And if we want to force it, let's just go ahead and do that and force this application to sync. So that is what the problem was. I'm glad that we were able to sort that out. Let's just go back and take a look here and make sure that that one container stays running, and it does. And we'll see that this one will drop off here in a second. And we can actually probably just delete that. Let's just go ahead and delete the pod. Okay, so it's not behaving, so let's do this the easy way. Let's just actually go ahead and recreate this application. So let's delete the application from here. We'll let this delete. We'll make sure that everything is cleaned up on the cluster, which it is. So let's just go ahead and quickly create that application again. We'll deploy it into default, automatic, prune. Our path is // as we described earlier. Default, let's create it. Okay, perfect. Now we are healthy and synced. All right, so now that that is running and we have our deployment and service manifests that have been configured, what we now need to do is we need to make sure that every time a build occurs, that it updates this tag. So in order to do that, let's jump back into our Jenkins file, and we're going to need to add another stage. So what we'll need to do here is we'll need to use some shell script, and we'll use sed to replace the tag inside of our container. So in order to do that, let's go ahead and create a new stage. So let's copy this stage. And we can actually clean this up. So there's quite a few things inside of this script tag. So let's clean that up. And then we're going to call this one trigger continuous delivery pipeline. Okay, so I'll go through this as slowly as possible. Again, I do apologize. I know this video is quite long, but I want to make sure that this is an important step to make sure that we can automatically update the manifests. So here, Jenkins has the ability to trigger another pipeline by passing it parameters. And there's a couple of things that you need to set up for this to work. So we do need to create an API token for the Jenkins user. And then we'll match it with a token in the build step for the second pipeline. But first, let's just go ahead and create this, the actual script that does that. So it's a shell script, and what we're going to do is we're going to actually curl over to our Jenkins machine to trigger it. So I'm just going to go ahead and type this out. So we're going to use the user admin. And then what we'll do is we'll create an API token. So let's just put a placeholder in here for now. We'll call it Jenkins API token. And then we're going to post. And then we need to specify some headers here. So again, you can look up these headers. It's not too important. Just know that you need these headers to be passed. So we need to pass cache control. We need to say no cache. Another header that we need to pass is the content type. And what we're going to be setting is application xwww, and it's a form. And it's a URL encoded. Let's just make sure we got the spelling correct here. And then data that we're going to pass along. So now this is the actual image tag variable that we're going to pass. So we're going to say image underscore tag. And that's equal to what we had defined earlier, which is image tag. And then we need to specify our Jenkins server, which in our case is running at jenkins.dev.email.cloud. Okay, so here we need to specify which job that we want to trigger. So what we're going to do is let's go ahead and go into Jenkins. And then let's create a new item. We'll call this GitOps complete pipeline. So let's just make sure we save that name. We'll come back and adjust this, but for right now, let's just create that so we have it waiting for us. So let's go back in here. So the job name, so this is the second pipeline, the pipeline that's going to do our updating of the manifest for us. So let's pass the the pipeline name. And then what we also need to do is we need to pass some additional parameters. So here we need to say build with parameter. Let's make sure we spell that correctly. Parameter. And then a token. So this is a token that we'll set up on our pipeline, which I'll show you here in a second. And then for the token, we can just call it anything we want. So we can just say, for example, GitOps token. And then we need to close that and then end it with a single quote. Perfect. So that should be all we need here. And if we've got all the, okay, so we're missing a curly bracket somewhere. So let me just make sure, Jenkins, we've got that. I do not need that there. I'm just going to go through and make sure I don't have any spelling mistakes in here, and I'm sure I will, which we'll find when we run the pipeline. But so there's a cache control with no cache. The header type is URL encoded. We're going to pass it the image tag, and then that should be good. Okay, so let's save that. And then what we're going to do is let's go into our Jenkins and configure this pipeline. So we'll do the same thing here. So this, remember, this is the GitOps pipeline now. So we'll keep a maximum of 2 builds. This build is parameterized. So the parameter that we used was image tag. So this is what will be passed in. And again, this image tag will be passed in based on what we're building above. So let's add a string parameter of image tag. We don't need to specify any default values. And then what we do need to do is specify a token. So we're just make sure that we have that correct. And then we need to trigger remotely because we're gonna, this is our first pipeline is gonna call this pipeline. And then here is where we need to specify the token that we'd made up. So in our case, we just called it GitOps token. And then here, we're going to, again, use the SCM. We're going to use Git. This time we want to make sure that we use our GitHub, our GitOps repo. So let's specify that one. And we don't have a Jenkins file here yet, but we'll create one. We can use the same GitHub credentials that we'd set up earlier. We want to make sure that we're using the main branch. We'll call it Jenkins file. So let's apply and save. Okay, so now we have this pipeline built. What we need to do is we now need to create the Jenkins file that will replace the tags and deploy the file and push it to GitHub. So let's go back into our command prompt. And what we want to do here is let's take a look here for 1 second. So what we need to do is we need to create a Jenkins file. So let's see. Okay, sorry for that delay. What I was actually doing is from another machine, I was copying over a Jenkins file just to save us some time instead of going through and building it. So let me show you that Jenkins file. So what we did is I copied over this file, and again, I'll walk you through it. It'll just save us some time from building it out, and it's quite straightforward. So let's go ahead and enable word wrap. So just like we did before, we need to specify the Jenkins agent. In this case, the label that we specified matches what we'd created in our Jenkins UI. We've created an app name. So this is just the application name, which we'll use a little later on. Again, we'll clean up our workspace. It's always a good practice to do that. We're checking out the GitHub repository. So we want to make sure we're checking out the actual repository for the manifest files. And then this is the trick here. The trick is really just a very basic shell script. So if you want to run multiple commands on different lines, you can just use 3 quotes. So we're just going to cat the deployment file to see what it looks like. And then we're going to use sed to basically just search and replace the image tag with an image tag that we're passing in as the build argument. And then we're going to modify the deployment.yaml. And then the next stage will be just for us to push that deployment file to Git. This is very straightforward. Again, we're just setting our global username, email address. We're going to add that deployment YAML. We're going to commit it with a message. And then we're going to use our credentials. So again, this Jenkins file is not anything complicated. So I just wanted to save some time and copy that over for us. So there's one more modification that we'll have to make in our other Jenkins file. So here you can see that we've got this app name that's been specified. So we'll need to also do this in our Jenkins file for the application repository. So let's go into that one, which we can find over here. So we'll just need to go ahead and add that in here. And then we do need to create the application token. So we didn't create the Jenkins token before. So that's the other thing that we need to do. So let's go back into our Jenkins. Let's click on our username, click on configure. And then we want to create an API token. So we can give it a token name of Jenkins API token. So this is the token that we're going to use to allow the second pipeline to be triggered from. So let's copy this. Let's make sure that we have that saved. And then we need to go into the dashboard, manage Jenkins. The system is running just a little bit slow here. And then for manage Jenkins, we want to manage credentials. We want to create a new credential. We're going to create a secret text. We need to paste in that secret text. And then here we can call this Jenkins API token. Let's give it the same name. And then we can create that. So now that we've created that, we need to then go back into our Jenkins file and add an additional variable. So we need to say that the Jenkins API token, so this is what we were calling it down here. So if we go look, we see it was Jenkins API token. But since we're calling it as a variable, we'll need to define that as well. So let's also call that, and we'll define that as, and we called it the same name. So we can just do that simply. Great. So now if everything works correctly, we should be able to run our pipeline. The last stage of this pipeline will make a call using the admin user and the Jenkins token that we just created. It'll call that new job with the parameter. And in this case, it's the image tag, which will be the new updated image tag, and call that second pipeline. And that second pipeline should then trigger. So if we go back and take a look at the second pipeline, it'll clean up its workspace, check out the repository where the deployment and service YAMLs are. It'll search and replace the image tag with the build parameter tag that we just pass in, commit that, and push it to our Git repository. So let's go ahead and give this a run and see what happens. So more than likely, it'll fail the first time because nothing ever works the first time, but it should give us some good troubleshooting steps. So let's go ahead and let this run through. So we're building the application. Okay, so it's going to go through our Sonarqube analysis. It's onto the build stage. So now this should create a new Docker image. It'll tag it with 1.0.0.12. If you remember, that's what we had set up for our image tag to be. It'll also tag it with latest. And if all goes well, it should then call our second pipeline job, which will update the tag and then commit that to our GitOps repository, which will then be picked up by Argo CD and be continuously deployed. So let's see, we should be almost done. So it looks like the build finished. So let's go back to our job. Let's look at the GitOps pipeline and see if this one actually triggered. So it doesn't look like it has triggered. So let's see why that did not happen. Maybe we didn't specify the right name. So let's go back and take a look. Oh, I know why. Because we did not save and commit those files. So we need to commit everything before we change it. So if we go back here, so in the GitOps pipeline, so this one, we need to make sure that we commit our Jenkins file. So let's commit. So this is the Jenkins file. And then we need to push that. But then in our application, we also made changes to our Jenkins file. So if we take a look, just to show you what happened here, if we do a git diff on that Jenkins file, we added that whole stage, but we never actually committed it. So that's why it didn't trigger the second job. So let's add this as well. And then added CD stage. And then let's push that up. So now we should have everything committed. And if we go back into our pipeline, let's go ahead and rebuild this again. So this time it's going to run another job. In this case, it's going to be build 13. I guess we'll see if the number 13 is going to be lucky for us. So let's see what's happening. It looks like there's a failure, so not so lucky. Let's see what happened here. Let's look at the console output. App name equals to... Oh, I do not think that we actually need that in here. So let me fix that. If we go back into our Visual Studio Code, and it is not this one, it's this one that it's complaining about. So complete, and let's just look at that error message again. Yep, so we'd already specified this, so it was a duplicate. So it's been a long video, so you can imagine. So let's commit that again. So it was a duplicate entry that we'd made, which is why that had actually happened. So let's remove duplicate env. Okay, so now let's go back in and build this job. Okay, so this time it is running indeed. So as you can see, there are lots of moving parts when you're building a complete DevOps pipeline. So it is important that you're careful. You use Git as we've been doing, so in case you need to go back and revert any changes. But hopefully you are learning something by watching this tutorial. If you do find it useful, again, please do comment. If you found this too long, I'm happy to take negative feedback as well. So any comment is a good comment. So please just let me know what you think. If this is useful, if these types of videos are useful. It certainly does take a lot of time for me to put these together. So if you're finding them useful, I'm more than happy to create more content like this. So let's see here. We should be almost done with our pipeline. A few more seconds. And if we are lucky, this time it will kick off that second job. Unless, of course, we made any more silly little mistakes that we may need to fix. Okay, so that has now finished. Let's go back to our dashboard. Let's take a look at this job. And we can see that it has not triggered. So let's go back and see why did that not trigger. So let's look at the output of the console here. And then we'll want to go all the way to the bottom. So we can see that it did the Docker login here. So that's okay. So it looks like it did try to connect. And we're getting some certificate warnings, which is fine. And it looks like it does not like our token. So let's see, what did we do wrong with that token? Let's go back and have a quick look. So we created a Jenkins API token, which is stored here. We scroll down and take a look. We're signing in with the token that was created. And what could be the problem here? Let's take a quick look. Okay, so I see what the problem is. The problem is that we didn't specify the environment variable correctly. So this is actually incorrect. The way that we need to specify this is we need to say credentials, and then we need to specify the credential this way. So let's make sure that we've got that spelt correctly. Let's save that. And then let's take a look at our status here. So git commit fixed typo, but this time it was in Jenkins file. Okay, so fingers crossed. Let's see if this is the last run that we need to do. So let's go ahead and build this. Appreciate you guys hanging in there with me. Again, this is a long video. Hopefully you did load up on some coffee or some Red Bull. I will be leaving some chapters in the bottom of the video description, so you'll be able to fast forward and look at certain parts of this. But again, I'm not going to edit any of this because I think it is important. I keep reiterating that, but it is important to see the troubleshooting steps that need to take place as you're building these pipelines, because they can get very complex and there are a lot of moving parts and things that you need to remember. Okay, so let's see what happens this time. Let's actually go ahead and watch the console while this is running. So let's look at the console output. We should be nearing the end of our Docker build here. And then once it pushes it, we're going to hope that this time it actually authenticates to our second pipeline and triggers the job. So let's see. Okay, so it's pushed. It's successful. Okay, so we didn't get any error messages this time. Now let's go back to our dashboard. It looks like this pipeline has indeed triggered, but we do have some errors. Okay, so we've made progress. Let's troubleshoot this one now. Let's take a look at what's happening here. Hopefully this is something straightforward. So let's take a look. And it is authenticating. Want to make sure that we have the right repository that we're checking out here. Maybe that is let's just make sure that we have the right repository. So if we refresh this page, we want to make sure that we are indeed using this repository in our Jenkins file. So let's quickly make sure that we are. Okay, so everything looks good here. Oh, and very simple. We have the wrong credential. So this is GitHub. So we need to make sure we set the correct credentials. Okay, so I am pretty confident that this will be the final run. So we change that in our GitOps. So let's add, and then let's commit fixed GitHub auth token. Let's push this. Okay. And this should be our final run. Let's go back in here, build now. Let's give this just see, it takes about a minute for each one of these to finish. So let's go through this. Again, if you've stuck with me this far, I appreciate it. Thank you so much. If this has been valuable, consider subscribing to the channel, giving it a thumbs up, sharing this video. I'm new to YouTube, so I'm sure there's certain things that I could be doing better. So please leave comments below. Let me know what I can do to provide more value. If there's anything that I can change, if these are too long, I'm happy to try and break these up into smaller videos as well. So any feedback would be greatly appreciated. So let's give this a few more seconds. Based on our prior runs, it looks like it takes about 40 to 45 seconds for Docker to finish building and pushing. And the good news is our second pipeline should only take a few seconds, because all we're doing there is we're checking out the code and we're doing a search and replace of the image tag and then just pushing that back out again. So that should only take less than 20 to 30 seconds. So it looks like this is nearing its completion here. So that has finished. Let's go back and take a look at our second job. And this should trigger, which it did, and it looks like it completed successfully. So let's take a look at the console output and make sure that it did update our tags as we expected it to. So if we scroll down, so the first time we looked at the deployment file was tag 11. We did a search and replace. It updated it to tag 16. And if all is well, our Argo CD should now be able to pick up that latest change and run version 16. So let's see. If we look at app details, we can see it is indeed running version 16. Okay, so thank you all for bearing with me. I know this was a very long video, but hopefully you found this helpful. Again, Appreciate your time. Appreciate you sticking through to the end. If there's anything else that I can help you with, leave a comment below. With that, thank you so much.